so what I wanted to do here is take you through the various parts of that cycle. So I described what a typical cycle is like, and I broke it up into 8 parts. The early phase of the cycle, where debt growth is good. Then you get into a bubble phase. Then you create the top. Then you create the movement down. I'll call that the depression. It could be a severe recession, but it's a depression. Particularly, you get into special ones when central bank monetary policy can't be stimulated because you have the zero interest rates and the limitations to that. And then you go into a deleveraging. And there's such a thing as a beautiful deleveraging. I described it as a beautiful deleveraging because it's a beautiful way to restructure and get that behind you. And although we think of a deleveraging or as a depression, that kind of thing, you think of deleveraging, but it can be done beautifully. And then you have normalization and you end that kind of cycle. So I want to take the first phase is healthy debt growth, right? In other words, debt's rising, debt's and gets return on investment, and then that's good. And normally what happens in a cycle is it comes from first your terrible period, the really painful period, and everybody is scared and so on. And then central banks have got to push credit and whatever, and then they go through the process of changing the cost of interest rates, the yield curve, I gave the example, show lower interest rates, put liquidity out and get that thing going, and even backing things up, and then you begin, and then we'll get to the second phase, which is sort of the bubble phase. And that bubble phase comes about when everybody is extrapolating the past, and they say, oh, things are going to be better, and I'm missing the boat, and all the ideas of why borrowing at an effective rate is a good thing. That borrowing could be, let's say, people buying the houses because housing prices are going up, and you don't own a home, and okay, what are you going to do with your rentals or whatever it may end up being? It could be the tech bubble in 2000. In other words, there's the new technologies of tech, and we're going to buy those stocks, and we're going to borrow money to buy those stocks, and so on, because you're being left out. Or it could be, maybe, who knows, is it a bubble now? So, but you can see these elements exist in the bubble phase. These are the bubble phase. Prices are high relative to traditional measures. I won't embellish quite on each one of those. Maybe I could take it in your Q&A, but I want to give them to you quickly. Prices are high relative to traditional measures. Prices are discounting rapid future appreciation from these highs. What I mean by that is you can look at market pricing and deduce from market pricing the picture that is being painted of what the future looks like. In other words, if I look at the relation between stocks and bond yields, there's an implied growth rate. And if I look at the relationship between inflation index bonds and nominal bonds, I can calculate what the market is discounting in the form of future inflation rate. And so there's a picture of the future. And if the future is different than that picture, that will determine the returns of asset classes. And so at times, at tops, what you tend to see is, here it is late in a cycle, and there's been quite a lot of debt growth, and you start to reach your limits, and yet the market is extrapolating or priced for an acceleration to take place. But, I mean, how's an acceleration going to take place if you're later in your limits? So that's what I mean by the second. There is more broad bullish sentiment. In other words, you're walking around and everybody says, oh, this is great and it's going to go up. Then there are purchases financed by high leverage. So that's apparent, buy on borrowed money, buy stocks on borrowed money, buy whatever the asset is, buy homes or whatever it is. And then sometimes buyers have exceptionally extended forward purchases. In other words, built-in inventory. because they're worried it's going to go up, I have a good inventory. Or contracted for supplies because they work up. Or maybe buy an apartment to speculate that the price of the apartments are going to go up. And people in general are buying those things in that particular appreciation. And then in addition, that there are new buyers who come in. You know, they never used to do it, but now they're attracted to it because it's a hot market. And so you see them coming in. You know, the classic example of the tulip mania. You know, okay, you're coming in, I need to have tulips, and oh, it's a great thing to have. And you see that. And then you see a stimulative monetary policy that is going to inflate the bubble. And so when you see these things simultaneously, you'll see a lot of those. You can almost have that checklist, and you could check off those things. And when you start to see that, you know, that becomes largely unsustainable. So here is this. These charts are just the averages of various items in these various 48 cases. So the first chart shows the equity prices, and it shows, so the red box, it takes it through the cycle. The red box, which I'll show your attention, divert your attention to, is showing what's happening in equity prices, that cycle. And then it shows also debt and debt service payments, and you could see that rising. And then what you could start to see here is in that bubble phase, this chart shows changes in debts as a percentage of GDP, and changes in debt debt service changes in debt minus the change in GDP growth. So in other words, the rise in debt relative to GDP. And so you could see, while you look at that, that red line is in the vicinity of 20%. In other words, debt is growing at a very accelerated pace. And it's rising, the change in debt minus GDP is rising still at something like a 10% pace. And so you could start to see these bubbles emerging. I see it in all different countries when you see that kind of very accelerated pace of debt growth, like it's very difficult to imagine. And then just below it, I'm showing the short-term interest rate, and you could see that there's not much tightening of monetary policy during that period to slow that rate of debt growth. Okay? Of course, a number of things are happening that I listed that long list, so I'm not going to go through them all.
By far the best investment you can make is in yourself. If you invest in yourself, nobody can take it away from you.